In 1962, a secret Pentagon program picked the rifle American troops would carry into Vietnam. The man behind that decision ran his own private war. No paper trail, just cash, contracts, and jungle testing grounds stretching from Saigon to Bangkok. Within 2 years, he was indicted. Within 4, he was in federal prison. This was Project AGILE, the ARPA program that armed a war, tested chemicals on entire forests, and collapsed under its own secrecy. It birthed the M16. It birthed Agent Orange. Before DARPA built the internet, it built this, and almost nobody remembers his name. His name was William Godel, deputy director of a young agency called ARPA. He watched Washington strip away its space programs and hand them to NASA. Nothing left to run there, so he built something new. In 1961, Godel proposed a classified counterinsurgency effort for Vietnam and Thailand. He called it Project AGILE. No public debate, just a directive, a budget line, and a man who answered to almost no one. Godel opened field offices in Saigon and Bangkok, staffed with engineers, chemists, and social scientists, and ran it like his own private company. Insiders later called it his own covert operations shop. For years, barely anyone above him asked how. Weapons came first. Godel's teams noticed something the Pentagon had missed. American rifles were too heavy for a typical South Vietnamese soldier's frame. So AGILE tested lightweight Armalite AR-15s under real combat conditions. The 1962 field report was blunt. Vietnamese troops preferred the AR-15 outright, hands down. Within months, requests for 20,000 rifles landed on Pentagon desks. That weapon became the M16, still carried a decade later, born from a classified test nobody outside AGILE ever formally approved. Surveillance was next and stranger. AGILE engineers scattered seismic and acoustic sensors through the jungle canopy. Some shaped like plants, one disguised as animal droppings. Signals traveled to orbiting aircraft, then to a windowless command center in Thailand. Computers turned vibrations into coordinates, coordinates into airstrikes. It was clumsy, half-blind, occasionally absurd. But it planted the seed for what became Operation Igloo White, an automated battlefield built inside a program with almost no outside oversight watching it. Then came the chemicals. Subproject 6 tested herbicides across upland jungle terrain in Thailand through 1964 and 1965, spraying Agent Purple and Agent Orange to strip away the canopy hiding enemy movement below. Scientists measured application rates, seasonal timing, canopy penetration, treating a living landscape like a laboratory bench. The goal was simple: starve the jungle of cover and starve the enemy of concealment. The consequence was not simple at all. Agent Orange remains AGILE's most infamous legacy, tracing directly back to this one subproject. For more subprojects ran quieter, but they never stopped moving. One studied remote transport, amphibious craft, STOL aircraft, jungle airstrips carved out of nothing. Another built radios and power supplies for terrain with no infrastructure at all. A third folded in psychological warfare alongside battlefield medicine and casualty research. The last handled planning, terrain studies, morbidity data, lessons pulled from insurgencies in Algeria and Latin America. None made headlines. All fed the same sprawling machine. The unraveling started quietly, buried in Pentagon paperwork. Investigators began looking into Godel's finances around 1963, tracing loans he and a colleague, John Wiley, arranged through fiscal agents inside the Department of Defense. By 1964, Godel was fired and indicted. Wiley had funneled the money into boats and cars. Godel's cash had gone somewhere else entirely, into unrecorded covert operations scattered across Vietnam and Thailand, spending no auditor could ever fully trace. In 1966, a federal jury acquitted him of embezzlement outright but convicted him on conspiracy and false statements instead. 5 years in prison. The man who armed a war never returned to run one. He simply vanished from the record. Project AGILE, stripped of its founder, kept operating regardless. Bureaucracy doesn't stop for one man's downfall. By 1967, AGILE's surveillance work had outgrown it entirely. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara wanted a physical barrier sealing off North Vietnamese infiltration routes, the so-called McNamara Line. Mines and fences proved impossible to maintain under fire, so planners pivoted to something electronic. Sensors, relay aircraft, mainframe computers. The concept cycled through code names, Practice 9, Illinois City, Die Marker, before settling into Muscle Shoals sometime in 1967. Its first real test came at Khe Sanh in early 1968, where sensor data helped American commanders detect North Vietnamese troop buildups ahead of a brutal, prolonged siege. It worked well enough to matter. By June 1968, the program carried a new name entirely, Operation Igloo White. What had begun as one gadget testing subproject buried inside Agile's paperwork now had its own billion-dollar annual budget, its own secret airbase in Thailand, and its own three-story command room glowing with screens nobody outside was ever allowed to see. The rifle kept moving on its own timeline. After the 1962 report, the Air Force adopted the AR-15 first, as the M16. By 1964, the Army followed suit, and within a few years the weapon had fully replaced the older M14 as the standard American infantry rifle across Vietnam. It remains one of Agile's only genuinely unambiguous successes, a program riddled with scandal and failure elsewhere, yet responsible for arming a generation of American troops with a rifle still recognizable and still controversial today. Meanwhile, ARPA itself was drowning in its own image problem. By the late 1960s, the agency was seen as a liability. Tangled in Vietnam, tied to scandal, running programs nobody could explain to Congress. Deputy Secretary of Defense Cyrus Vance had pushed to abolish the agency outright just a few years earlier in 1965. In March 1972, officials finally rebranded it. ARPA became DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. One added letter, one deliberate attempt to signal distance from everything Agile had quietly become. The war was already ending regardless. In January 1973, the Paris Peace Accords formally ended direct American military involvement in Vietnam altogether. Task Force Alpha shut down within the year, its IBM computers shipped home, its command room stripped bare. Igloo White's 20,000 sensors, scattered across a jungle that had outlasted every attempt to map or control it, went silent one by one. Agile limped on one more year, its founder long forgotten. In 1974, the Pentagon finally closed the file for good, quietly. 13 years, a rifle, a chemical, a scandal, and a war that ended anyway. DARPA's own historians don't sugarcoat this one. Look up Project AGILE on the agency's official timeline today, and the language turns almost apologetic. A program run with barely any oversight, hardly scientific, focused entirely on quick fixes instead of lasting, durable solutions. One man controlled budgets, contracts, and covert cash flows across two entire countries, and almost nobody above him ever asked how. That structure wasn't an accident. It was designed to move fast and dodge congressional scrutiny. But speed without accountability eventually collapses under its own weight, and Agile became the textbook case DARPA still points to internally, not as a triumph but as a warning. What happens when a defense agency skips the checks nobody wanted to enforce in the first place? Every program that followed inherited that lesson quietly, whether anyone ever said Godel's name out loud again or not. Then there's the simplest failure. It didn't work. Billions of dollars, thousands of buried sensors, an entire computerized command center humming around the clock, and the Ho Chi Minh Trail kept running anyway, year after grinding year. North Vietnamese engineers repaired bombed roads within hours and built bypasses through untouched jungle. They rerouted convoys around known sensor fields, then simply moved supplies at night when aerial coverage thinned out completely. Analysts back in Thailand could estimate truck counts, claim destroyed tonnage, brief generals with impressive-looking numbers glowing on a screen. None of it was verifiable on the ground. The trail itself grew more sophisticated every year. Agile poured money into stopping it, not less. Technology had promised to replace soldiers with sensors entirely. The jungle simply refused to cooperate with that particular fantasy. ARPA was also fighting to survive as an institution. It had lost its space programs to NASA years earlier. Its missile defense work stalled. Its nuclear detection programs had largely run their course by the late 60s, leaving little left to justify the budget line item. Agile was, for a while, one of the only things still generating headlines inside the Pentagon. Mostly bad ones, unfortunately. Deputy Secretary of Defense Cyrus Vance had pushed to abolish the entire agency around 1965, frustrated by exactly this kind of runaway spending with almost nothing concrete to show for it afterward. Keeping a scandal-tainted, strategically ineffective Vietnam program alive made institutional survival even harder to argue for convincingly. Cutting it loose eventually became less a hard decision and more a quiet formality nobody particularly wanted to fight over anymore. By 1973, the war that justified AGILE's existence was already over. The Paris Peace Accords ended direct combat involvement, and the rationale evaporated overnight. Keeping a Vietnam-specific counterinsurgency program alive made no institutional sense once there was no Vietnam War left to actually fight anymore. So in 1974, 13 long years after Godel first proposed it in a Pentagon memo, officials closed the file for good, quietly, without ceremony or fanfare. What survived wasn't the program itself, but its scattered fragments instead. A rifle still in active service decades later, a chemical whose damage outlasted every soldier who ever sprayed it across that jungle, and a sensor network that quietly became the blueprint for automated border surveillance systems built long after everyone involved had died, retired, or simply been forgotten by history entirely.